On a frigid February night in 1985, in the small town of Beatrice, Nebraska, a beloved 68-year-old grandmother named Helen Wilson was raped and suffocated to death in her own apartment. And the police, in the weeks that followed, did something almost impossible to comprehend. They got not one, but 6 people to be convicted of her murder. 5 of those 6 confessed to it, and every single one of them was completely, provably innocent. This is not a story about a killer who was clever enough to evade justice for decades. It's the opposite. It's a story about a case where the police found the right man almost immediately. A local with a rape on his record, whose own grandmother lived in Helen Wilson's building. And then, because of one botched laboratory test, let him walk out the door. And then, instead of the truth, they built a monstrous fiction. They rounded up 6 ordinary people who had nothing to do with the crime, threatened them with the death penalty, and used a police psychologist to convince several of them that they had committed a murder and simply forgotten it. Some of those innocent people came to genuinely believe they were killers. If cases like this one are why you're here, the ones where the system itself is the mystery, and DNA is the only thing that finally tells the truth, subscribe to Decades Cold, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. This is exactly what we do here. 6 innocent people would go to prison for the murder of Helen Wilson. Together, they would lose 77 years of their lives. And only one of them refused, from the very beginning, to confess to something he didn't do, and refused, for 2 decades, to stop fighting. He demanded that the DNA evidence, preserved since 1985, finally be tested. And when it was, it did 2 things at once. It cleared all 6 of them, completely and beyond argument, and it pointed every single profile at one man, acting alone, the very first suspect the police had cleared, all those years earlier. A man who, by the time the DNA finally named him, had been dead for 16 years. This is the story of Helen Wilson, the 6 innocent people convicted of killing her, and the science that told the truth everyone else had gotten catastrophically wrong. Before this became a case about wrongful convictions and false confessions and one of the largest legal settlements in Nebraska history, it was, first and most importantly, about the death of a real woman, and she deserves to be at the center of it, not lost behind the scandal that followed. Helen Wilson was 68 years old, and she was, by every account, exactly the kind of person a small town treasures. She was a widow, she had lost her husband early in life, and she had raised her 3 children in Beatrice, the same town she'd stay in for the rest of her days. She was a grandmother 7 times over and a great-grandmother 5 times over, and by all accounts those children were the joy of her life. She looked forward to making new memories with them. She was beloved. She was the sort of woman whose absence leaves a hole in a whole community, not just a family. She lived alone, in a first-floor apartment in downtown Beatrice. But she was never really alone in the way that matters. Her family checked in on her constantly, and that closeness is part of what makes the beginning of this story so painful. On the night of February 5, 1985, Helen had been feeling sick, and so, as they so often did, her family came to check on her. Her son Daryl and his wife went by that evening to look in on the mother and mother-in-law they loved. It was an ordinary act of family devotion, checking on an older relative who wasn't feeling well on a cold winter night. And it was Helen's family who would come to understand that something was terribly, unthinkably wrong. Because Helen Wilson had not simply been sick. In her own apartment, in the town where she'd spent her whole life, surrounded by the community that adored her, Helen had been attacked. And the horror of what was done to her would, over the next quarter of a century, become entangled with a second horror. A failure of the justice system so profound that it would swallow 6 more innocent lives before the truth finally came out. Helen Wilson was found raped and suffocated in her apartment. She was 68 years old, a grandmother, killed in the most brutal and intimate way imaginable, in the one place she should have been safest. I'll say no more about the details of the assault than that, because they don't honor her and they aren't the point. What matters, for the investigation, is what the killer left behind. Because the person who did this to Helen left physical evidence at the scene. There was blood that did not belong to Helen, apparently shed by her attacker, and there was semen, recovered from the assault. In 1985, that evidence could not be turned into a name the way DNA can today, but it could be typed. And here is the single most important forensic fact in this entire case, the fact that everything else hinges on. The blood type of the evidence at the scene was distinctive. It was a specific and relatively rare type. That is a powerful narrowing tool. It meant that whoever the killer was, he belonged to a small fraction of the population, and, just as importantly, that anyone who did not have that blood type could be conclusively excluded as the source of that evidence. Think about what that means. In 1985, before DNA, the police already possessed a scientific filter that could rule suspects out, not identify one definitively, but exclude the innocent. The blood and semen at the scene came from a man with a specific profile, and any suspect whose biology didn't match that profile simply could not have left it. That evidence should have been the backbone of the case, the thing that kept the investigation honest, that stopped it from convicting the wrong people. Instead, that same evidence, the blood type, the semen, would be misread at the worst possible moment, and then, later, quietly set aside when it pointed away from the people the police had decided were guilty. The science that should have protected the innocent was, through error and through choice, turned into the instrument of one of the worst miscarriages of justice this country has ever seen, and it began with the man the police found first. Early in the investigation, the police developed a genuinely strong suspect. His name was Bruce Allen Smith, and on paper he was close to a perfect fit. Start with where he was that night. On the night Helen Wilson was killed, Smith had been out drinking, and he'd gone to a party. At that party, according to later testimony, he threatened to rape a woman who was there. He was thrown out for it, and on his way out he reportedly threatened to get even. So here is a man who, on the very night of a rape murder, was expelled from a gathering for threatening to rape someone, and who left angry and vowing retaliation. That alone would make any detective's ears prick up. But it went further. Bruce Allen Smith had a prior arrest for rape from 1981, an established history of exactly the kind of violence that had just been done to Helen Wilson. And most damning of all, in terms of opportunity, Smith's own grandmother lived in Helen Wilson's building. He had a reason to be there. He had a connection to the very address where the murder happened. A violent history, a threat to rape someone hours before, a personal link to the building. Investigators were right to focus on him. They tracked Bruce Allen Smith down. He'd gone to Oklahoma, and they questioned him. He denied any knowledge of the crime, but crucially, they collected samples from him, including blood, to compare against the distinctive evidence from the scene. And then the case went catastrophically off the rails because of a laboratory error. When Smith's blood was analyzed against the rare type evidence from the crime scene, the testing indicated that he did not match. The lab results said Smith wasn't the source of the blood and semen. And so, on the strength of that analysis, investigators cleared Bruce Allen Smith. They let him go. They removed the actual killer from their list of suspects because a flawed test told them his biology didn't fit. The real murderer of Helen Wilson had been in their hands, and a mistake in a lab handed him his freedom. That single error is the seed from which every other tragedy in this case grew. With their best suspect eliminated by that faulty test, the investigation into Helen Wilson's murder stalled, and then it went cold. And a cold case involving a beloved grandmother, in a small town that wanted answers, creates enormous pressure. Pressure to solve it. Pressure to give the community a resolution. And that kind of pressure, we've learned again and again, is dangerous, because it can push an investigation toward the answer it wants rather than the answer that's true. Years into the case, the investigation was reignited by a tip. A 17-year-old informant told authorities that a local woman named Ada Taylor had confessed to being involved in Helen Wilson's murder. Now, a tip like that has to be checked. That's legitimate police work. But what happened next was not a careful test of whether the tip was true. It became the foundation for an entire theory of the crime that the evidence never supported. Investigators turned their attention to a loose group of local people on the fringes of the town, described by those who later studied the case as misfits, people with troubled or chaotic lives, vague connections to one another, and to the periphery of the case. 6 of them, ultimately, Joseph White, Thomas Winslow, Ada Joanne Taylor, Deborah Sheldon, James Dean, and Kathy Gonzalez. There was a theory forming, and it's important to understand it because it shaped everything. The police had come to believe that Helen Wilson's murder was not the work of one man, but of a group, that multiple people had been involved. And once you've decided the answer is a group of people, you go looking for a group of people. And you can find connections and confirmations that aren't really there, because that's what the human mind does when it's already sure. The 6 individuals who became known as the Beatrice 6 had, in reality, nothing to do with Helen Wilson's death. But they were about to be swept into a case built not on physical evidence, but on something far more fragile and far more manipulable, the human memory. This is the part of the case that is genuinely hard to believe, and it is the reason this story has been studied by psychologists and legal scholars ever since. Because 5 of these 6 innocent people confessed. They gave statements. Several of them described the crime. 4 of them gave detailed accounts that implicated themselves and the others. And they did all of this despite the simple, absolute fact that none of them had been there, and none of them had done anything. How does that happen? How do you get an innocent person to confess to raping and murdering a grandmother? The answer in this case is a combination of 2 things, and both of them are terrifying. The first was fear. Several of the 6 were confronted with the threat of the death penalty. The message, explicit or implicit, that if they did not cooperate and confess, they could be executed. Imagine sitting in a small-town interrogation room, frightened, perhaps not the most sophisticated person in the world, being told that your life itself is on the line unless you go along with what the investigators want. That pressure alone has produced false confessions throughout the history of criminal justice. But the second thing is what makes this case extraordinary, and it involved a mental health professional. A police psychologist named Wayne Price worked with several of the suspects and advanced the idea that they had repressed their memories of the crime, that they had, in fact, participated in the murder of Helen Wilson, but had buried the trauma so deeply they couldn't consciously recall it. Think about how insidious that is. You tell a vulnerable, frightened person, you don't remember doing this, because your mind has protected you from the horror of it. Now let's work together to recover those memories. And they were shown crime scene evidence, given details, walked through the story. And slowly, some of them didn't just falsely confess to escape a threat. They came to genuinely believe it. Ada Taylor, Deborah Sheldon, James Dean. By the end of the process, some of them actually believed they had helped murder Helen Wilson. Their own memories had been overwritten. They had been convinced, from the inside, that they were killers. That is one of the most chilling things the human mind is capable of, and this case is one of the starkest demonstrations of it ever documented. There was one who never broke. His name was Joseph White, and through the entire ordeal, the pressure, the threats, the psychological manipulation that folded his co-defendants one by one, Joseph White refused to confess to a murder he had not committed. He said he was innocent, and he never stopped saying it. But here is the cruel machinery of what had been built. White didn't need to confess to be convicted, because the false confessions of the others had become the evidence against him. His co-defendants, having been convinced or coerced into implicating themselves, had also implicated him. And so, in late 1989, Joseph White was tried for first-degree murder and convicted, largely on the strength of the false testimony of the very people who had been manipulated into believing a fiction. He was found guilty of a killing he had nothing to do with, on the word of innocent people who had been persuaded they were all guilty together. The others were folded into the case through guilty pleas and no contest pleas, several of them pleading to lesser roles like aiding and abetting, some undoubtedly taking deals because, once you're trapped inside a case like this, with the death penalty on the table and your own friends testifying against you, a plea can feel like the only way to survive. In the end, 6 people stood convicted of the murder of Helen Wilson. 6 people who were, every one of them, completely innocent. And so they went to prison. Collectively, the Beatrice 6 would serve around 77 years behind bars for a crime none of them committed. 77 years of human life, of birthdays and holidays and children growing up on the outside, poured into a punishment for something that never happened, at least not by their hands. And all the while, the physical evidence, the blood, the semen, the distinctive type, sat preserved, quietly holding the truth. The truth that the science, done correctly, could have told anyone willing to listen, that not one of these 6 people matched the evidence from the scene. This is the detail that turns the Beatrice 6 case from a tragedy into a scandal. Because the exculpatory evidence, the evidence that could have stopped all of this, was not missing. It existed. It had been generated in 1985 by the state's own forensic scientist, and it was simply never put in front of the jury. Her name was Dr. Rena Roy, and she was a forensic scientist with the Nebraska State Patrol. Back in 1985, she analyzed the blood and semen recovered from the crime scene, and her analysis reached a clear conclusion. None of the defendants, none of the people who would become the Beatrice 6, was a specific match to the biological evidence found at the scene. The science, done by the state's own expert, pointed away from all 6 of them. It was, in effect, a scientific declaration of their innocence, sitting in the case file, and Dr. Rena Roy was never called to testify. Her analysis, which excluded the very people on trial, was not presented to the jury that convicted them. Sit with the enormity of that. The state possessed forensic evidence indicating that the accused did not match the crime scene, and that evidence was sidelined while a case built on manufactured memories and coerced confessions was allowed to send 6 innocent people to prison. This is the recurring, terrible danger of an investigation that has already decided what it believes. Evidence that fits the theory gets amplified, and evidence that contradicts it, even hard scientific evidence from your own lab, gets minimized, explained away, or simply left in a drawer. The truth was in the file the whole time. It was just inconvenient. For the Beatrice 6, that preserved evidence was both the instrument of their conviction, misread and set aside, and, eventually, the only thing that could set them free. It would take one of them refusing to give up, and it would take the arrival of DNA testing to finally force that evidence to speak. The one who forced it was Joseph White, the man who had never confessed, and who had spent his years in prison doing the thing that solves so many of the cases we cover, refusing to let go. White maintained his innocence throughout his incarceration, and he pushed, through the legal system, for the one thing that could definitively prove what he had been saying all along. He demanded that the biological evidence in the case, the evidence preserved since 1985, be subjected to modern DNA testing. This is worth appreciating for what it was. By the 2000s, DNA testing had matured into exactly the tool that could resolve a case like this with total clarity. The old blood typing from 1985 could narrow things and, done properly, exclude people, but DNA could go all the way. It could take the blood and semen from the scene and derive a precise genetic profile, and then compare that profile unambiguously against any individual. It could say, with the certainty that has convicted and freed thousands, exactly whose biological material was left at the scene of Helen Wilson's murder. And critically, the evidence still existed. It had been preserved through all those years, waiting, the way physical evidence waits. White's persistence broke through. The testing was ordered. And in 2008, more than 2 decades after Helen Wilson's death, the preserved blood and semen from the crime scene were finally analyzed with modern DNA science. 6 people who had spent a combined lifetime in prison were about to learn what that evidence had been holding all along, and so was the state of Nebraska. The results came back in 2008, and they were conclusive in a way that left no room for argument. First, the DNA excluded all 6 of the Beatrice 6, every one of them. The blood at the scene, the semen recovered from Helen Wilson's body, none of it came from Joseph White, or Thomas Winslow, or Ada Taylor, or Deborah Sheldon, or James Dean, or Kathy Gonzalez. The science said with total certainty what Dr. Rena Roy's analysis had quietly indicated back in 1985, and what Joseph White had insisted for 20 years. These 6 people did not do it. They were innocent, all of them. And then the DNA did the second thing, because every profile from that crime scene, all of it, pointed to one single man, not a group, not 6 people, one man, acting alone. And when investigators identified whose genetic profile it was, the answer landed like a hammer on the entire case. The DNA belonged to Bruce Allen Smith, the original prime suspect. The man with the rape record whose grandmother lived in Helen Wilson's building, who had threatened to rape a woman the very night of the murder. The man the police had found at the very beginning and then cleared and released because a botched blood typing test told them he didn't match. He had matched all along. The faulty science that freed him in 1985 had been catastrophically wrong. He was the killer. He had always been the killer, and he had done it alone. There would be no trial for Bruce Allen Smith, because by 2008, when the DNA finally named him, Bruce Allen Smith had been dead for 16 years. He had died in 1992 in Oklahoma of AIDS at around 30 years old, after a life that included further run-ins with the law. The real killer of Helen Wilson never spent a single day in prison for her murder. He walked out of that investigation in 1985 and lived out his remaining years a free man, while 6 innocent people served his time. In late 2008, the Beatrice 6 were released from prison. In 2009, they were officially exonerated and pardoned, becoming the first group of people ever exonerated by DNA evidence in the history of Nebraska. Exoneration is the word we use, and it sounds clean, like a door opening and everyone walking back out into their lives. It is not that. The cost of this case was staggering, and it did not end when the prison doors opened. Start with the 77 years. 6 people had lost, collectively, 3/4 of a century of life to prison for a crime they did not commit. You cannot give that back. The birthdays, the funerals they missed, the children who grew up without them, the ordinary years that were simply erased, none of it returns. And the damage went deeper than the lost time, into something almost harder to comprehend. Remember that several of these people had been convinced, through psychological manipulation, that they had actually committed the murder. That kind of damage doesn't just evaporate when a DNA test clears you. Some of the Beatrice 6 reportedly struggled, even after their exoneration, with the psychological aftermath of having been made to believe they were killers. To have your own memory turned against you, to have been convinced from the inside that you did something monstrous, and then to be told years later that none of it was real, that is a wound that a pardon cannot heal. And Joseph White, the one who never confessed, who fought for 2 decades, who demanded the DNA testing that freed all 6 of them, did not get to enjoy the vindication he had earned for everyone. White filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against Gage County on behalf of all 6 of them, seeking accountability for what had been done. But he died in 2011 in a workplace accident before that case was resolved. The man most responsible for the truth finally coming out did not live to see the reckoning. The lawsuit went forward without him, to trial in 2014, and in 2016 the surviving members of the Beatrice 6 were awarded around $28 million in damages, one of the largest wrongful conviction judgments of its kind. It was a form of justice. But it also fell, financially, on the taxpayers of a small rural county, who spent years shouldering the cost of a mistake made decades earlier, and the town itself was left divided, some accepting the exonerations, and some, including members of Helen Wilson's own family, left angry and unsettled by a resolution that overturned everything they'd been told for 20 years about who killed her. That is the true cost of getting it wrong, not just the guilty going free, though he did, but the innocent paying his price, the community fractured, the family of the victim robbed twice, once of Helen, and once of the certainty they'd been given about her killer. The Beatrice 6 case is one of the most important cautionary tales in the entire history of American criminal justice, and it leaves us with lessons that reach far beyond this one small Nebraska town. The first is about confession itself, and it overturns something most of us intuitively believe. We tend to assume that no innocent person would ever confess to a murder, that a confession, especially a detailed one, must be true, because who would admit to something so terrible if they hadn't done it? This case is the definitive refutation of that assumption. 5 innocent people confessed. Under enough fear, enough pressure, and enough psychological manipulation, the human mind can be led not just to say it did something it didn't do, but to actually believe it. A confession is not proof. Sometimes it's the deepest kind of false evidence there is, because it feels so unquestionable. The second lesson is about physical evidence, and it's the reason this channel exists. Everything that went wrong in this case, The coerced confessions, the manufactured memories, the misread blood test, the sidelined expert. All of it was ultimately corrected by the same thing: preserved biological evidence, read correctly, with the tools of a later era. The DNA didn't care about the theory of the crime, or the confessions, or the pressure, or what the town wanted to believe. It simply told the truth. These 6 did not do it, and this one man did. Human beings, under stress and certainty and institutional momentum, got almost everything wrong. The evidence, patient and silent in a storage room, got it right. And it's a double-edged reminder, because that same category of evidence, misread in 1985, is also what freed the real killer and helped doom the innocent. The science is only ever as good as the humility of the people using it. And the last thing is Helen Wilson herself, because she is so easily lost in the enormity of what came after. She was a 68-year-old grandmother, beloved by a whole town, killed in her own home by a man the police caught and released. For 24 years, the official story of her death was a lie. 6 innocent people convicted, the real killer free and then dead. She deserved the truth, and it took a quarter of a century to arrive. When it finally did, it came too late to punish the man who took her, and it came wrapped in the wreckage of 6 other stolen lives. But it came. The evidence Helen's killer left behind eventually named him, exactly, and cleared the innocent, exactly. It could not give anyone their years back. All it could do was, at last, tell the truth. If this story stayed with you, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And subscribe, because the next one is already waiting.